After the economic bubble and subsequent reset of the late 1980s and early 1990s, economic news from Japan has remained relatively quiet, and a great deal of what we do hear about the Japanese economy tends to lean towards the negative. However, the conjectural could hardly be further from the actual. Japan is still the world's third largest economy, and the relationship between Canada and Japan has never been better. There are thousands of Canadian companies that depend on Japan, and there are over 100 Canadian companies that maintain a permanent Japanese address. At the heart of the relationship between Japanese and Canadian business is the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Japan, the CCCJ. Today on the Global Canadian Business Forum, we're going to ask about the CCCJ and find out how a Canadian company can enter and succeed in the Japanese market. My guest today is Niel van Wouw, chair of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Japan. Niel is also founder and CEO of Vanten, a trailblazing IT company focusing on digital signs in Tokyo. Niel, welcome to the Global Canadian Business Forum.
Great to be here.
Niel, you've been in Japan since 1986. You've no doubt seen a lot of changes. But before we get into the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Vanten?
Sure. As you mentioned, I came in '86, right after Expo '86 in Vancouver, and I originally came on a working holiday, as many young Canadians have in the past, and ended up getting involved in interesting work and staying. So in the early days, I was doing software development in computer graphics for civil engineering, and I got my hands on the internet very early, and that was a stepping stone to being one of the first commercial internet providers in Japan. And '98, I started my own company doing internet services, and then moving into digital signage very early, from around 2003.
So let's go into the CCCJ in Japan. How long has it been in operation?
The CCCJ is the longest running Canadian chamber in Asia. It started in 1975. And
in terms of the size now, how many members do you have at the chamber?
We have about 400 members. The CCCJ covers about 35 business industries and sectors. It's really almost everything you can imagine. Agri-food, automotive, resources, forestry, mining, and financial, fintech, insurance, and more these days. A lot of Canadian startups, IT companies, EC, etc., getting into Japan,
which is right down your alley.
Indeed. Canada is a world leader in AI these days, and Japan, like most developed countries, is putting a big emphasis on increasing capability. Of course, it's not that easy to just go and produce the next generation of data scientists and specialists in AI. So this is a really good opportunity for Canada to collaborate.
And we've seen quite a number of companies reach out and try to take advantage of the relationship. Of course, look at CCCJ and try to take advantage of some of the relationships that you have already in existence. Can you tell me, just as throw it out there as an example, right? If a Canadian that is perhaps either currently living in Japan or maybe is considering moving to Japan, and maybe they have a product or a service that they think would do well in the Japanese market, do you recommend that they first contact the CCJ, or is that something that perhaps they should speak to you after they start get going?
Well, they certainly should. I encourage Canadians in Japan to join the CCCJ as soon as possible. Now, in terms of their market entry, the embassy has some great services. JETRO has some great services. Some of our members are involved in that. So again, that is a role through the chamber. But it's not all just those steps of how you build your market, how you build your sales. You want to also be building, your network and getting involved in a community. There's all these things that you run into that you need to deal with that aren't just exactly in, how do you get the next customer? And so that's kind of when you have the community, you get to rely on, you get to meet people and get this advantage of all this experience around you. People who have, you name it, someone else has been through it and dealt with it.
Sure. Like many businesses, whether it be abroad or even back home here in Canada, that networking component is critical, I think, for the success for any company.
Indeed, it is. But when I talk about membership in the CCCJ, that's not always my first pitch. Especially if I'm talking to Canadians, I look at our chamber as it's a community, and it's the leading business association in Japan of stakeholders in the Canada-Japan relationship. So my question to all Canadians here is, are you a stakeholder in that relationship? And when you put it that way, most people are come up with a yes pretty quickly. And then it's like, well, wouldn't you want this community to be stronger so that we can do more? And I think often that's actually the thing that gets people to go, yeah, okay, well, I guess I should get in there, right? And then it's after you get involved, you realize there's so many other benefits too. So I think it's worth supporting from the get-go based on that, but there are so many benefits as well.
And when you mentioned before about 400 members, now does that refer to just corporate membership or individual membership as well?
It's both. So we have large companies, very, very large companies, smaller companies, individuals, and we have a very significant portion of our membership is our Japanese companies and Japanese individuals.
That I'm assuming have some vested interest in learning or becoming more involved in the Canadian market.
Yeah. So in a way, those folks are also stakeholders in the relationship. Is their companies doing business in Canada, thinking of doing business in Canada? Many or many people that have spent time in Canada through a previous job or through school. Many people, Japanese folks, have gone and spent time in university or even in high school, and these connections can be very strong. Years later, I run into people that I know, businessmen and women that they went to school in Canada 20, 30 years ago, and they're just now wanting to reconnect with that community because it was such an important part of their sort of formative years. So those, when you run across people like that feel that strong connection, and we can bring them together, there's so much we can do together.
Just to back up a little bit, what sort of opportunities do you currently see in Japan?
Well, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. And Japan is a very stable country. The rule of law is very strong, and that's very important for business. So I think people doing business in Japan with Japanese companies, it's often takes a bit of legwork to get it off the ground. But once that's established, you won't find a better partner anywhere. So when you think of as for Canadian businesses, it's always the easiest thing to just go and work south of the border where 70-80% of Canada's trade is, right? But if you look at both, most companies know that there's a shift to in the growth of the world economy happening in Asia. So how are you going to step into Asia? And Japan, as a big economy in its own right, is an obvious first stepping stone. But especially through the recent CPTPP, Japan can now become a stepping stone to many other Asian countries. You could work with a Japanese partner and conquer, all of Southeast Asia.
What are your top 3 pieces of advice for Canadians that are considering Japan as a market to get into?
Okay, my first piece of advice would be to adapt to the market, because almost anything that you bring into Japan is going to require some tweaking for the market. It's a very, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, something about the product or the service or the way it's delivered or the way it's marketed perhaps, it needs to be adjusted for the Japanese market. Often that's as simple as adding Japanese to the, to the product. And my second thing would be to really focus on building relationships, because it's these relationships that turn into the long-term partnerships and very, very productive, loyal partnerships. And my third piece of advice would be stick with it, because sometimes the getting up and running, for example, if you're in technology, Japanese companies are infamous perhaps for asking endless detailed questions about the technology, trying to really, really understand it deeply. And often that's very frustrating for Western companies. They'll be thinking, well, why would anyone need to know that? Why would anyone need that level of detail? And eventually the cooperation level starts to go down, right? And it seems like there's no end in sight, but it's kind of this, if you stick with it, get through this, then when everyone's, happy, then the partnership, blossoms into real business, and it's worth it. So that's my third piece of advice. And if I was allowed one more, it would be join the chamber.
What would the goals of the chamber be moving forward?
Well, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, really working on building our community. It's we're in a business association, so a lot of our activities are very business focused. But as I said, we're shareholders of the relationship between Canada, stakeholders of the relationship between Canada and Japan. So in a way, anything we can do to make that stronger and better is a good thing. So just to, if I can give you a recent example that's very topical, we just finished up the Rugby World Cup here in Japan. By all accounts, an extremely successful tournament. And I don't know how much the news hit on your side, but there was the Canadian team was received a lot of kudos for some community involvement after the game was canceled in northern Japan. So we were there. We were right there with the team. We were on the street when they were shoveling the mud. And in fact, the main picture that was spread on Twitter and throughout the world was actually the person in the center was one of our members and mistaken for a team member because of the t-shirt that we made to help support the area. And our purpose was, of course, we wanted to go up there and watch a great rugby game. But we also were there to see what we could do to make ties between the local community and the team. And we got much more involved with that aspect than we expected to. And that incident or that activity resonated extremely deeply with Japanese people. So much so that I've checked this with other Canadians here. Now, a month later, people are still walking up to me and saying, when they find out I'm Canadian, Japanese people are still thanking me for being Canadian because of what our team did. So in my over 30 years here, this is probably the biggest thing to happen, literally, to Canada-Japan relations. And it was not something anybody would have expected, with Canada going into that tournament, right? But so that kind of thing is something that we can really leverage. And we are in fact still involved with that community, and we've had several follow-up events post rugby tournament, and we hope to continue building on that kind of connection. Because at the end of the day, it's always the people-to-people connections that resonate and then spread to great business opportunities.
Any plans to be involved with the Olympics next year?
Indeed, yes. We are hoping to be involved, and we have been having many meetings with the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and we're looking forward to being involved with Canada House here in Tokyo. So I hope to see many folks coming over from Canada and meeting them here. Hopefully, in some of them in chamber related events that we will hopefully be doing around that time.
Niel, thank you very much for participating.
My pleasure. It's been very interesting.
And thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Until next time.